Welcome back to France 24. We are live from Paris. The headlines this hour. The number of coronavirus patients in ICUs in France at a 3.5-month high. New measures to limit the spread of the virus are set to go into effect. The European Commission, meanwhile, is warning that the onset of flu season could prove deadly. French prosecutors open an inquiry into BNP Paribas. The banking giant is accused of complicity in crimes against humanity, genocide and torture in Sudan between 2002 and 2008. And Fatah and Hamas say they've put their differences aside and will hold elections within the next 6 months. The Palestinian factions coming together after the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain normalized ties with Israel. We begin with the latest on the coronavirus pandemic in France first, and the number of COVID-19 patients in ICUs in the country has surpassed 1,000 for the first time since the 8th of June. Yesterday, the health minister unveiled stricter measures to tackle the spread of the virus. Bars and restaurants will be shutting entirely in the city of Marseille from Saturday, and next week, bars in the capital Paris will have to shut at 10. The European Commission, meanwhile, is warning that the onset of flu season could herald a deadly twin-demic. Brian Quinn filed this report.
Marienplatz, the symbolic heart of Munich, where face masks are now mandatory. Among residents and visitors, mixed feelings.
Ist auf der einen Seite schon eine gute Sache, weil doch die Infektionszahl immer höher wird.
Finde ich jetzt schon ein bisschen extrem irgendwie.
Europeans may be experiencing coronavirus fatigue after months of distancing measures, but as the continent passes the grim milestone of more than 5 million COVID-19 cases, the European Commission says renewed discipline is necessary to avoid another round of nationwide lockdowns.
We are at a decisive moment. It might be our last chance to prevent a repeat of last spring.
Among new stricter measures announced this week, in the Italian region of Campania around Naples, face masks must be worn everywhere at all times. In the UK, with some 42,000 deaths, Europe's hardest hit country, it's table service only at pubs and bars, which must now close at 10 p.m. Since the pandemic's arrival, Sweden has bucked conventional wisdom, counting on voluntary prudence among its citizens instead of lockdowns and mask requirements. Now, amid a worrying rise in new cases, the government says it's ready to take necessary steps, but not just yet.
Hamnar vi i ett läge där smittspridningen fortsätter att öka, då kommer vi inte heller att tveka en sekund att vidta ytterligare restriktioner. Jag hoppas att det inte ska vara nödvändigt.
Virus cases are also on a troubling rise in Spain, where authorities have called on urgent help from the military to help fend off a second wave.
Now, the French government has put the Caribbean island of Guadeloupe on its highest alert level for the coronavirus. The overseas territory is one of 2 zones that will have to close bars and restaurants for 2 weeks. Businesses fear the decision will lead to economic catastrophe. Emerald Maxwell reports.
From Saturday, all bars and restaurants in Guadeloupe will have to close for 2 weeks. The manager of this restaurant in Pointe-à-Pitre thinks the measure is a disaster.
De toute façon, la saison, je pense qu'elle est cuite, c'est fini. Je pense qu'il va y avoir beaucoup de casse. Je pense qu'il va y avoir beaucoup de restaurants, d'établissements de tourisme qui vont fermer.
Some are hoping that the extreme measure will allow some room for flexibility.
On attend pour voir dans quelles conditions on va être fermé. Est-ce qu'il y aura de l'emporter, comme un peu comme la dernière fois. Donc à savoir, est-ce qu'il y aura de l'emporter, comment on va fonctionner réellement la restauration en journée.
As they enjoyed one of their last evenings out, customers were also unconvinced by the move.
Je suis contre. Pourquoi? Parce que je pense qu'il faudra vivre avec. Et c'est pas en faisant à chaque fois 2 semaines on ferme, 1 mois on ferme, que tout va s'arranger.
Je trouve ça complètement ridicule parce que tous les bars, tous les restaurants appliquent des mesures de précaution. Et quand on va sur les plages, ces derniers temps, on a assisté à des rassemblements familiaux, amicaux.
With Guadeloupe on France's maximum alert level, all establishments welcoming the public will have to close, apart from theatres, cinemas and museums, where strict sanitary measures are already in place.
Now, in the past 24 hours, the number of COVID-19 infections in France have come in at 16,000. That's versus 13,000 on Wednesday. Next, prosecutors here in France have opened an inquiry into banking giant BNP Paribas. This over claims of complicity in crimes against humanity, genocide and torture in Sudan between 2002 and 2008. Last year, 9 Sudanese victims backed by rights groups filed a criminal complaint against the bank. BNP Paribas was considered the de facto central bank of the regime despite international sanctions. Earlier, I spoke to a regional correspondent on what BNP is accused of doing.
The 9 Sudanese victims accuse BNP Paribas of complicity in crimes against humanity, torture, and genocide that took place in Sudan. They say the bank basically enabled the Sudanese government by financing it to carry on with its crimes in Darfur. Now, as you said, between 2002 and 2008, it was considered to be Sudan's de facto central bank. Now, during this period, the government, through its military security forces, and the Janjaweed militia committed widespread human rights violations, which amount to international crimes. These violations targeted Sudanese citizens from non-Arab tribes. The bank enabled the regime at a time when it was under international sanctions because of these crimes it was committing in Darfur. And so by granting the Sudanese regime access to the international money markets, it allowed the government to function in terms of being able to pay its staff and fund its military and security forces.
How significant is this investigation to the region?
Well, according to the International Federation for Human Rights, this investigation marks the first step to hold the French bank criminally responsible for its complicity in the international crimes committed in Sudan and in Darfur in particular. The International Criminal Court is already investigating allegations of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity committed in Sudan since 2002. And even though several arrest warrants have been issued, none have been executed. So it means to date that the extensive human rights committed have gone unpunished. And so the victims feel that this case marks the first step in attaining justice. It's important to note also that the bank did admit to acting as Sudan's foreign bank between 2002 and 2008. In a case that it admitted this in a case in the United States because it was dealing with countries such as Iran and Cuba, which were on the American sanctions list. So in this case, the bank had to pay $8.9 billion in July of 2014. Sadly, the Sudanese victims did not receive any compensation because the U.S. Congress divided the money and gave it to domestic victims of terrorist attacks.
Now, in other news, Palestinian factions Fatah and Hamas have decided to put their differences aside and hold elections within the next 6 months. The vote would be in stages, starting with a parliamentary vote, then a presidential vote, and then finally the election of members of the PLO. Now, Fatah and Hamas were pushed towards each other after the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain normalized ties with Israel. For more, we can bring in France 24's Nadia Masi from our International Affairs desk. Nadia, this isn't the first time these two sides have tried to play nice, but why now?
Well, as you alluded to, timing is everything here. You know, these two sides have tried to sit down at the table together, patch up this disagreement many times over the past 13 years, but now they've been propelled to an apparent agreement because of that normalization of ties between the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel. That has left Palestinians, both politicians and Palestinian people, feeling extremely isolated. And this comes after an extremely difficult couple of years for Palestinians and the Palestinian perspective on that conflict. We have Donald Trump in the White House, a man who's made it very clear that he has a lot of empathy with the Israeli perspective on this issue. We've seen him dispatch his son-in-law Jared Kushner to the region for this so-called deal of the century that we understand apparently involved moving the Palestinian capital out of Jerusalem, something that clearly really didn't please Palestinians at the time. We had proposals earlier this year to annex parts of the West Bank by Israel, and now we have this deal that normalizes ties between major Gulf states and Israel. And that is kind of a geopolitical bloc which is ending up isolating Hamas on the international stage and isolating Iran, its key backer. So that's why we're seeing this deal now. And it is worth saying, though, that even though we've seen kind of relations improve in recent months ahead of this agreement, this is a pretty tight timeline towards elections, just 6 months after 13 years of real dispute between the two sides. So I wouldn't be surprised if these elections don't quite happen according to schedule. And if they do happen, I also wouldn't be surprised if they're not particularly democratic in nature. You know, we've seen Hamas effectively control Gaza in the past 13 years. Fatah do something very similar with the West Bank. These areas have become less democratic, not more democratic in the past decade or so. So I wouldn't hold your breath for a democratic transition of power in the Palestinian territories.
Now, let's just assume for argument's sake that this election does go ahead and take place within the next 6 months. How then will life change for ordinary Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank?
Well, the first thing to say is, you know, the geographical realities for Palestinians won't change at all. It is still Israeli authorities that will control who can leave or enter Gaza and the West Bank. It will still be hard for people to visit their families in opposing areas, to go abroad for medical treatment. But if those elections are held, and as we've been saying, that's a big if, the outcome, I think, is far from certain. What we do know is that both in Gaza and in the West Bank, there is deep distrust of their political leaders. Both Hamas and Fatah are very unpopular in the areas that they control. Mahmoud Abbas, who's run the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank for years now, he's seen as being extremely corrupt by Palestinians. He's seen as being somebody who has coordinated with the Israeli government but failed to materially improve the lives of Palestinians in the area that he controls. And I think there is some question now as to whether or not he will stand again in this election. He is 84 years old. He is highly unpopular. There are other people waiting in the wings who I think would be far more popular on the Palestinian street, who may want to try and run in his place. Now, in Gaza, Hamas also deeply unpopular as well. It's seen as being obviously a very ideological group and one whose policies have meant that Gaza have contributed to how isolated Gaza has been from the rest of the world for the past several years. Of course, it's deemed a terrorist entity by the United States, by a number of other world bodies, and that's meant that it's been hard to get funding and financial aid into Gaza. Now, if there are elections, and there's been some sort of anecdotal evidence that what may happen is that Hamas loses control of Gaza because it's unpopular there, but Fatah loses control of the West Bank because it's unpopular there as well. And in fact, we may see a switch in the power bases, which would be quite extraordinary. That may mean Gaza opens up a little to the international world, but perhaps a closure when it comes to the West Bank. So I think, you know, it's very hard to predict what's going to happen. Let's see if those elections happen at all. Let's see how democratic they are, and then let's have a look at how that'll affect lives for the Palestinians in the coming years.
And first, let's see what happens out on the 3rd of November in the United States, because clearly if Donald Trump wins the election again, we'll have more of the same, or if there's a Joe Biden presidency, maybe things will change on the ground.
Absolutely.
We'll see what happens. Nadia, thank you very much for that. Nadia Masi there. Next, one of Hong Kong's leading pro-democracy activists, Joshua Wong, was arrested today over his participation in a demonstration last year. He was quickly released but faces a new court date at the end of the month. Wong is already facing other charges over last year's pro-democracy protests, which led Beijing to impose a new national security law on Hong Kong. Brian Quinn reports.
Hong Kong Central Police Station, where Joshua Wong was hit with a new round of charges Thursday. The city's most prominent pro-democracy activist says it's part of a concerted effort by Beijing to smother dissent.
They can prosecute us, they can arrest us, they can lock us up in prison, but they can't censor our commitment, continue to fight for freedom. And it's time to let the world to know that how the judicial system is being weaponized to be the tools for the authorities to silence the voice of dissidents.
The 23-year-old Wong, arrested and charged for his participation in an unauthorized demonstration last October against an anti-mask law intended to help police identify protesters. That law currently faces a constitutional challenge, as the coronavirus pandemic has in fact led the government to make face masks mandatory. Thursday's charges are the latest in a series of arrests of Hong Kong dissidents in the wake of a sweeping new national security law imposed on Asia's premier financial hub by Beijing in June. Under the law, anyone convicted of subversion, separatism, or collusion with foreign forces faces up to life in prison, measures condemned by UN human rights experts. The law was passed in response to months of intense street protests as Hong Kongers pushed back against China's efforts to undermine the former British colony's legislative and judicial autonomy under the framework known as One Country, Two Systems. Wong is due to appear in court next week. He says it's only a matter of time before the National Security Police come for him.